Welcome to another episode of Progress, Potential, and Possibilities, discussions with fascinating people designing a better tomorrow for all of us. I'm your host, Ira Pastor.
Welcome everybody again to another episode of our show, bringing you another really fascinating guest today, helping to create a better tomorrow in the healthcare domain on some really unique fronts and technologies. Today we have the honor of being joined by Dr. Richard Burt, who is a Fulbright scholar, professor of medicine at Scripps Healthcare, a tenured retired professor of medicine at Northwestern University, where he served for many years as chief of immunotherapy and autoimmune diseases, as well as current chief executive officer of Janani Biotechnology. Dr. Burt, for the last few decades, has endeavored first in animal models, and then, of course, with some very public world's first clinical trials, bringing the field of stem cell and cellular therapy to patients' bedsides. Dr. Burt has published more than 145, mostly first author articles. He is also the editor of 4 medical textbooks. He was the first autoimmune committee chairperson for the International Bone Marrow Transplant Registry, and was the principal investigator of the NIH's $10 million multi-centered contract to develop stem cell clinical trials for autoimmune diseases. Dr. Burt performed America's first hematopoietic stem cell transplant for multiple sclerosis, lupus, Crohn's disease, as well as chronic inflammatory demyelinating polyneuropathy and stiff person syndrome, and published the world's first randomized clinical stem cell transplant trials for systemic sclerosis and multiple sclerosis. He has been awarded numerous awards, the Leukemia Scholar of America, the Lupus Foundation America Fidelitas Award, the Van Beckham Award for the European Society of Blood and Bone Marrow Transplantation, the Distinguished Clinical Achievement Award by the Clinical Research Forum and the European Group for Blood and Marrow Transplant Clinical Achievement Award. He has been presented in the Vatican with the Keys to the Vatican, was a speaker at the Festival of Thinkers and Leadership at Healthcare in the UAE, and chaired the biotech session at the Baku, Azerbaijan International Humanitarian Forum, and has been recognized extensively by Science Illustrated for accomplishing one of the top 10 medical breakthroughs in the next 10 years, and by Scientific American as one of the top 50 individuals for improving humanity and outstanding leadership. And aside from all that, he's also now his new book, Everyday Miracles Curing Multiple Sclerosis, Scleroderma, and Autoimmune Diseases by Hematopoietic Stem Cell Transplant, is actually coming out tomorrow. Be available in all major booksellers. Check for the forward with the Dalai Lama as well. We're honored to have him with us today. Dr. Richard Burt, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show.
Thank you for having me.
It's great having you. I've really enjoyed over the years following your work in this fascinating set of domains. I would really like to start off today. If we could sort of like start the episode off just discussing autoimmune diseases for a little bit, because I took a look at the numbers before I came on this show, and they're huge. I think 4% of the world currently suffering from one of these 80 different diseases. Obviously, the public knows the big ones in terms of MS, rheumatoid arthritis, Crohn's disease, psoriasis, but there's dozens others that make up literally hundreds of millions of people around the world. And, coming out of pharma and having worked in the space and sort of knowing the past history of steroids and sort of old school disease modifying drugs and a little bit of, the current area of biologics, we still have a lot of really sick people out there. Talk a little bit about the autoimmune disease space as you look at it in 2023.
Well, I think that's a very astute observation. And I actually, the last chapter of my book, Everyday Miracles, is titled, Why Can't I Get HSCT Eyes Wide Closed? And the reason I titled that is because I spent 35 years developing this concept, this idea, first 10 years in animal models and basic bench research, learning really immunology, and then the last 25 years developing and doing clinical trials. And despite these clinical trials that have been quite successful, and despite multiple talks, numerous talks around the world, despite a lot of publications, many people still don't know about this, both in the medical community as physicians or healthcare providers, and patients. And so my patients have said, why aren't institutions and people standing on rooftops shouting about this? And that's actually one of the reasons why I decided to do this book, Everyday Miracles, because I wanted to inform lay people, the non-medical people.
Yep.
But in fact, I think physicians and healthcare providers will definitely enjoy this book as well, because I describe several different autoimmune diseases as well as these patient stories from the patient's perspective, as well as kind of the development of the field from my own point of view as a pioneer in it, with the idea of coming to me about 30 or 35 years ago. So I wanted this to be able to empower patients. And I think, I give 4 reasons in the last chapter why I think, despite the success, this hasn't taken off.
Mm-hmm.
One of those reasons is risk-benefit, because there is risk in doing a transplant. Someone could die.
Right.
And in fact, the largest registry for these transplants now exists in the EBMT, European Bone Marrow Transplant Registry, and there's, I think, over 3,000 there. And in the early days, not with me, but with EBMT, they had a mortality of around 5%
Mm-hmm.
from all the centers reporting. It has to do with many reasons, a learning curve and using cancer regimens instead of non-myeloablative immune-specific regimens, like I've always argued for. But anyway, that's markedly decreased. It's below 0.5% in the BTM registry now. In my own personal hands, my last publication of all our MS patients with a non-myeloablative regimen, 511, it's 0.2%.
Mm-hmm.
So there can still be mortality. And I think, there's an old axiom, do no harm in medicine. And so that has to always be considered. But on the other hand, everything has risk. Every medication has risk.
Sure.
Even normal saline can kill a patient. And it has killed my patients with scleroderma because the heart is very stiff. And if you give them normal saline too aggressively, not aggressive by a normal patient's standard, not if it was being given to me or you, but to a scleroderma patient, it'll throw them into heart failure and lung failure and they can pass away. And that has happened. I've seen that. So even a bag of water, well, salt water, normal saline, that's viewed totally innocuous, can and does kill people. It has happened. So, everything's both good and bad. Like a lot of young doctors think all these medications are miracle pills, and they can be, but they're also all have side effects, both short-term and long-term. And one of the things I have to repeatedly emphasize, when a patient's having a problem, first thing to do is look at their list of medications. It is not unusual to find that it's iatrogenic, that is induced by doctors giving these medications. They are all potential toxins. So, how do you treat anybody with anything? Given that scenario, everything's both good and bad. Nothing's 100%. Well, the way is informed consent. So as long as the patient understands all the risks, including in transplant, the difference between non-myeloablative and myeloablative. Myeloablative are those cancer regimens. Mine are more gentle, non-myeloablative, and by that nature safer, but not, again, you can't promise totally safe. So
Sure.
the key to all this is always informed consent. And kind of the irony of this is, when I first started it, people kind of looked at me like it was too risky. But it was weird because what took off in America are these aggressive cancer myeloablative regimens, which are much more intense and risky and not needed, absolutely not needed, that level of intensity. So I've been the one arguing for the safer regimens against these more intense regimens, which, by the way, were funded by NIAID, National Institute of Allergy and Immune or Infectious Disease, which I fought against as one of the original, as the PI on the original study all along, saying no. And I had the data and had the animal models. You want to use the safer immune specific, not cancer regimens. And I think with time, that'll be recognized and things will shift towards that. Because if you can get these really good results, why take that extra risk up front? Now, I think people take the risk because some people think that it may be better. But with such good results, I question that. And if you really want to do it, you got to compare the two intents, the myeloablative to non-myeloablative. And you can make non-myeloablatives as immune intense as a myeloablative without being myeloablative. It's how you design it. So, but the key is in the conditioning regimen, which gets rid of your old immune system, is kind of like how an astronomer looks at for planets that are habitable in other solar systems, because now they're finding them. And so they have to look for that habitable zone. In other words, not too close to the sun, not too far away. If it's too far away, it's too close. If it's too cold. If it's too close to the sun, it's too hot. Then they're not going to support life. So they want that habitable zone. And that's what the conditioning regimen is that you want. You don't want it too strong. It's too toxic. You don't want it too weak. It's not going to work. So you have to find that. And that depends. That varies by each disease. It's kind of like the habitable zone varies by the intensity of the stars. So these little red dwarfs, the planets have to be a lot closer, say around where Mercury is, which is stifling, burning hot for life for a yellow star, but for a red dwarf, it's kind of a nice fit for life. For a giant, we have an average size sun, so our habitable zone is kind of where most of them are. But for a bigger blue star, it has to be further away, somewhere out around Jupiter. So you have to adjust your conditioning regimen by the disease. There's not one conditioning regimen that fits all, and that's kind of in all honesty, kind of a gut instinct and trial and error to do that. But in this book, I describe where we've really figured out an optimal conditioning regimen, and if someone makes it better, all the better for them, but optimal for 5 diseases: MS, that is multiple sclerosis; systemic sclerosis, which is commonly called scleroderma by patients; neuromyelitis optica or Devick's disease, that's a demyelinating disease, akin to but different from MS; CIDP, chronic inflammatory demyelinating polyneuropathy, which is a disease of immune destruction of your peripheral nerves, whereas MS involves the spinal cord and the brain. CIDP gets your peripheral nerves, not the spinal cord, not the brain. And finally, Crohn's disease, which is a gastroenterology immune-mediated disorder. And when I went to write these patients up, because normally we follow and report out to 5 years, which is actually pretty long. It's compared to drug companies, which report 1 to 2 years. So that's pretty long in that comparison. And there's no pharmaceutical support in what we do. There's no patent or license or return of profit in what we do. It's purely an academic altruism to try to improve the health of patients. I think that risk benefit is one of the concerns, but understanding that, focusing on non-myeloablative, the right selection of patients and experience, center effect, will markedly minimize that and diminish it. But of course, you can never promise it to be zero. But that's a person's own choice, that, you're not living in their shoes, and these diseases can be horrible. And one of the things I do in these books is I take individual patient stories that I developed with them. And initially, I was hesitant to do that. It's kind of like a profiles of courage of patients. But I wanted the humanistic aspect to come out, because when I do publications, it's all statistical and it's dry and it's dull, and the human story gets lost. But I wanted that out there, and the best way to do that is give these patient stories. And there's 54 patient stories in here. I wish I could have done more, but they put limits because they say people won't read too big a book. So that's probably true. But in any event, because I'm trained with HIPAA that you can't release information, I obviously got every patient's consent in writing, and I co-developed it with them and had them proof it at the end to make sure they're comfortable with it. And I asked every patient to use a pseudonym with no last name, a pseudo first name, although if they wanted to use their real first name, they could. And I say that in the introduction, and I say I will not give any more information or deny or acknowledge anything about any of these patients because of my own belief in privacy. That's essential for a doctor-patient relationship. Nonetheless, these patients have all given written consent, all knew their story. They all got an advanced copy of the book. And, the truth is, I've treated so many patients, there'll be a lot of patients disappointed their story isn't in there. And I also regret that. Each patient has an incredible story. Going back again to why this isn't taking off, besides this concept of risk benefit, there's another big one, really big one. And I mentioned four of them in the book. I'll leave the last two for people who read the book. But the other one I title is homeless.
Okay.
And the reason for that is I was trained in Hem/Onc, and I used to transplant leukemias. That's how I got the award as Leukemia Scholar of America. It was a grant and for some gene therapy work and so forth. But I had this idea to apply this technology, but to soften it and make it non-myeloablative for autoimmune diseases. I explain in the book how I came up with that idea. And having been trained in hematology oncology, I had to learn these autoimmune diseases on my own and develop these protocols. And I found that people in those individual departments or divisions really weren't interested in this. So I self-taught. But you design your protocols. It takes about 2 years to do it. You have to read all the literature about this disease, all these clinical trials. And in a way, you can see them without your mind being already influenced by the general community. For instance, what I found in reading all the studies on MS is that they're approved by the FDA not for improving neurologic disability. They don't do that. Not for improving quality of life. They don't do that. I bring that out in the book. But because they slow progression of disease, and they can slow it usually in the early days by the number of new lesions on MRI, also then later by progression, neurologic progression, not reversing, but slowing it. And then they get the most recent way that people want to look at it is by no evidence of disease activity. That is no clinical text, no MRI progression, no neurologic progression. But it doesn't talk about quality of life, and it doesn't talk about reversal of disability. And that's the fundamental thing transplant does. So we could actually focus on a totally different endpoint and compared to all the drugs. Now, there are some drugs where there's a slight improvement in the SF-36, the standard quality of life, by like 1 to 2 points. And so then people could argue it does, and they report those. The problem is the minimal change in the SF-36 for a patient to appreciate an improvement in their quality of life is 5. It has to be 5. Otherwise, it's just a number, statistical number. When you do a mean in all the patients, it's improved compared to baseline by 1 point. But to an individual patient, that means nothing. They have to have a change of at least 5. In our studies, the improvement was 15 to 25 points. So it is real clinical improvement for a patient. Obviously, if neurologic disability reverses, which none of these drugs do, and if you get off drugs, which is the key to this, you do this and you're off all these drugs, you don't need them anymore, your quality of life improves. Now, it turns out about 23% of patients with non-myeloablative regimen that I use for MS relapse, but going out to 5 years, the majority didn't. And in writing this book, because I wasn't following people, I was contacting patients I treated the longest 21 years ago, 20, 15, more than 10 years ago. Most of the patients in here are that longer follow-up. I just randomly contacted them, and wow, they're still in remission. They're getting no treatments. Obviously, they weren't coming back to us. They're not getting MRIs or whatever because they're glad to be free of the medical system, but they're doing great. They got better. They stayed better. And so I still never use the word cure, even though in the title I use the word cure. I did that to capture people's attention, but I explain in there. I'm always hesitant to because there's no definition of a cure for these diseases. But when you do a one-time treatment and then you go for 10, 15, 20, 21 years, and you have no evidence of any new disease, you got better, it stayed better, maybe we can start thinking that way, or at least we've now changed the natural history of the disease. And so that's the key. But again, going back to what I was saying, I had to do this on my own. And I call it homeless because there is no department or
Sure.
Institute of Autoimmune Diseases. There's no National Institute of Autoimmune Diseases. There's no autoimmune disease institutes in America. And how can that happen? And the reason that happened is because medicine got put into different divisions and departments based on what we could see initially. You know, before technology, before microscopes, you'd do autopsies.
Right.
And so you could see the skin, and that became dermatology. You can see the eyes, ophthalmology. On autopsies, they could see the heart, and they figured out how circulation works and heart attacks. So that became cardiology, rhythm disturbances, cardiology. They saw the lungs, they saw the kidneys, nephrology, pulmonology. And then certain diseases were big enough that they became their own board certification, and institutes like cancer.
Right.
Emergency medicine, when I first started, wasn't a separate board certification.
Right.
Now it is. It became a separate board certification. Radiology became separate. But autoimmune diseases always remained orphaned into these different departments. For division of the ones I talk in here, MS is in neurology, Scleroderma is in rheumatology, and Crohn's is in gastroenterology.
Yep.
So, and I have a nice table in here of over 80 different autoimmune diseases and the different divisions that or departments that they're put in the book. It's saying exactly what you had said, is they're kind of homeless. And the reason for that is when all these were separated out, you treated by organ, you developed subspecialties by organ system. Nobody had a microscope to study and learn what immune cells are in the blood or what they do. Eventually, as that occurred, they set up immunology departments that did basic research on these immune cells. But that's basic research. The clinical care and clinical trials had already been set into the different divisions and departments. And so, they have their own little fiefdoms that are already established, and then it becomes very hard to change that. And when you come from the outside and you aren't trained in one of those departments or divisions, and you're getting these kind of results, it's naturally going to be met with skepticism. And what you're going to have, the result is you have people who have the basic knowledge of how to do this coming out of the field of hematology, that is transplant of leukemia,
Right.
but they don't know these diseases. They have no training at all. And then you have people who spend a lifetime training in these diseases, such as neurologists, rheumatologists, gastroenterologists, so forth, that do not know anything about transplant. To them, all transplants are the same. It's some cancer regimen that, markedly sick and all this stuff, and it's all myeloablative. And so they're hesitant to refer patients away to these people not trained in it. People not trained in it don't know the right group of people to take because they're focused and trained in a different disease. So, I call that homelessness. And what it really requires is people like me to subspecialize, just like transplant for leukemias, lymphomas, myelomas, so forth, is a subspecialty hematology. It does not have its own boards. It's hindered by that as well, but it's a subspecialty that people will identify with and focus on. It's going to require people to do that for these autoimmune diseases. You're going to have to really learn, even though you're a hematologist, you're going to have to really learn these autoimmune diseases that you decide to treat, or there could be a change where the federal government itself asks the NIH to set up an Institute of Autoimmune Disease.
Yeah.
And then fund centers to bring, as a center, all these different, very intelligent, but different departments, divisions together under one center to develop and focus on autoimmune diseases, not just the basic science, bring in the basic immunology departments, but the clinical care. And that includes having in them divisions of cellular therapy, such as, and there are many types of cellular therapies that will be coming forward in the future. CAR T cells that are used in cancer can be used for autoimmune diseases, but hematopoietic stem cell transplant, like I've shown, because nobody's had these kind of data with any of these drug company trials.
Right.
And so these are two of the reasons, risk, benefit, and homelessness, and there's two more, and I'll leave it for people to get the book to read, that they're well-meaning. Nobody's malicious. It's just the way the system has gotten structured and designed that when combined together significantly retard this development of this field, despite it being very, very successful. And so, when patients get frustrated, they say, oh, it's the fault of the FDA. It's not.
Yeah.
The FDA actually doesn't regulate homologous application of stem cells. It's a transfused blood product, so it's not the fault of the FDA. And so they have these, they say it's a drug company's fault, and it's not. I mean, not directly. Drug companies take a lot of financial risk to develop a drug. These drugs we're using are standard generic drugs. No drug company is going to do this for transplant because it's generic. If they do all the expense of a trial, they're not going to be able to monopolize. Somebody else will come in, and so they'll get nothing out of it. Their investors and the people in society invested into it get nothing out of it. So they don't hinder it, but it can't. There's no financial benefit to them for doing this, so they don't get involved. So it's not directly their fault. It's our system, our structure, and I bring that out in the book. So that's kind of a long answer, but
it's
answer you can. Unfortunately, our national media likes a 5-second catchphrase. Right. It's not that. It's not hanging a scarlet letter around one person or one group of people. It's our structure that has gotten set up that it requires working in this field to understand that, and that's what I bring out here.
Yeah,
the human stories in these patients.
Yeah, it's having it's funny because as I'm listening to your story, because in a past career I did spend time down at NIAMS in Bethesda, and I completely understand what you mean about all these orphans being there. And coming out of the pharma industry, absolutely. I mean, in essence, what you're describing, Richard, is sort of we talk a lot about this theme of repurposing on the show, of repurposing drugs, but you're sort of sort of describing the ultimate repurposing of a procedure of more than one procedure here. And yeah, I mean, it's I appreciate the way you laid that groundwork.
Well, here's a neat thing, if I can add.
Sure.
This book, I've been talking with a chief of staff of a U.S. congressman. He's got it. Good. He's figured it out. Yeah. So he will be distributing this book to every member of Congress and Senate this month. Yep. Now, I don't know if they'll read it, but it'll be in their hands. So maybe there will be some hopeful changes that will be beneficial coming forward.
A couple of things just popped to mind before we get into sort of a little bit of looking forward. I think, how can we get this done at a much larger scale? How much there's two very interesting, there's a lot of interesting stuff here, but two really interesting things. One, of course, as you're describing the fact that, so the curative endpoints are not there. They've never really been there for sort of traditional drugs, but you're describing something that is not just, it doesn't just have this mild myeloablative component. You are infusing new stem cells that not just reconstitute, but potentially have some unique immunomodulatory and regenerative effects as well, that you may be able down the road to see some regenerative dynamics as well that lead to those curative events, which I think is a really interesting part of any of these autoimmune diseases where whether it's the gut or the joints or the central nervous system that's being destroyed. At the same time, I was also thinking about, we did an episode a couple months ago on patient number 4 at the City of Hope, one of these HIV cure patients, which not the same thing, but of course is a case of myeloablation followed by reconstitution, followed by, hey, I don't have HIV anymore. I was just wondering how much some of those HIV cure stories, which have a little bit of a similar background, we don't normally do this, help or in some ways with you selling this grander autoimmune reversion story.
So, I don't work in HIV.
Right.
Obviously, being in medicine, I'm aware
Sure.
of it, run into people with HIV, so forth. But I don't work in it. I don't research in it. And I wouldn't be qualified to discuss that. And the reason I say that is because I see a lot of very intelligent, bright people give talks about transplant for autoimmune diseases in academia, but they've never done one. They don't do it. And what they're saying isn't really correct. And it's misleading. And the reason I know is because I lived this 24/7 for 30 years. And so the knowledge is not dangerous. It's a good thing, but limited knowledge is. Yeah. And how that comes about is when you're not doing it, when you're not living it, when you're totally removed from it, but you summarize it and you give all the talks and you become the speaker on it.
Right.
So for me to go into HIV, I would have such limited knowledge that I could say something that those people focused in that area would realize just
Right.
isn't accurate. So I want to refrain from doing that.
That's fine.
You know, the best way to get the accurate is read the original papers, especially the data section. That's the best way. And then to work in it yourself, of course, is an even better way. It's kind of like entropy. You know, the further away you get from where something was developed, the more disorganized the data and the information becomes. And the more, it's like somebody telling a story to somebody, to somebody, to somebody, that things get lost and it becomes inaccurate. So the key is to do it yourself, to read the original papers, especially the data, before you read the discussion or conclusion, and to get someone who's actually lived it, developed it, worked with it, to talk about it. And again, unfortunately, because in what I've developed, which really does work,
Right.
because of the arbitrary fiefdoms and divisions, as well as these other factors and two more that I talk about in the book, it's really been a hindrance to his development, right? It's tremendous success. So again, I decided finally, you know, I did 4 medical textbook. I did a major one. This one, 686 pages,
Yep.
that came out November 21st of 2021. 140 professors, associate professors, assistant professors, universities around the world, you know, virtually every continent contributed to this. But again, I don't think, unfortunately, you know, that's going to have a big impact. So I wanted to empower patients, because I think this will have a big impact. I wanted people who write legislation, who are involved in directing big money to how our system develops, to be aware of this. But most importantly, I wanted the patient to be aware, because for me, that's what it's all about. Ultimately, that's what medicine is about at the end of the day. It's helping that person in front of you. And so that's why I did this book. And so, you know, I'm really hopeful it might really be a great book and have an impact, or it may just be like everything else I write, nothing changes.
Yeah.
So we'll see. But I've kind of done all I can do.
No, I understand. No, no, you're, as I said, you're on one hand, you're dealing with something that's quite cutting edge. On the other hand, you know, you've outlined the pitfalls around it. How about the, you know, obviously, you know, you're brought to, you have a lot of prominence across this space, but you know, a couple of years ago, obviously all the stuff with Selma Blair and her particular case was you know, put the spotlight on you. And you know, I think is, you know, the other thing that when we talk about sort of the stem cell space in general is this whole area of patient funded trials and all that, and in the sense that you were mentioning that this when you put some of these therapies together, it does get expensive, but if there are those out there that do have the ability to afford it in this context of a medical procedure, you know, why not? What's the feel for you in terms of the current environment in terms of this? Because I know, you know, the stem cell space in general, whether it's reconstitution or some of the newer things that, you know, people are, you know, doing, you know, trying to go offshore for or whatever. It always comes with that little bit of baggage. It's like, oh, patient's paying for it, so thus it must not, you know. Talk a little bit about that side, because I've never had a problem with that. If there is someone with the money that is willing to go through informed consent to do something cutting edge, you know, why not? Especially if the system isn't set up to do it. Talk about that part of it a bit, if you would.
Right. So, again, there's been so much confusion in that. First of all, the vast majority of patients, insurance pays for it.
Good.
There are a few where it doesn't, or the people don't have the patients for the insurance, and they have the resources, they'll pay up front. And of course, people that have come from overseas, they don't have American insurance, so they either have their system over there pay or they pay. But for most Americans, insurance does pay. Now, to get insurance to pay, though, it can take many months, 6, 8, 10 months. And it's
Yeah.
going to them and filing the appeals and working with them and getting them the information. The key with insurance is to get a person or committee that accepts responsibility for that patient and their decision, and seeing that person as an individual. If you can do that, it usually works. If you deal with a large government organization where nobody accepts that responsibility, it doesn't work. So what happened with the development of the Affordable Care Act, there's nobody to talk to. So we could never get approval. It just stopped. We used to get approval for Medicaid, state run, all the time. And then when Affordable Care Act came out, my patients started telling me they were being flipped from Medicaid to the Affordable Care Act without them knowing. They were just notified. And then Affordable Care Act refused to pay for this. And there was no one you could talk to. So, it used to be, before Affordable Care Act, it's the unintended consequences of good intentions. But before that Medicaid would pay. So we could treat people that had absolutely no job, no money. And Medicaid would pay at an amount that the hospital would lose money. But for me, my goal is just to help the people, not the money. And fortunately, the hospital, would take Medicaid. So we really were able to help the poor and the homeless. And in my book, I talk about all types of people. A billionaire that I treated, a homeless person I treated, people from overseas, United Arab Emirates, India, the UK, where they couldn't get this therapy there. I talked about all types of Americans, whether there was someone in the Special Forces, a Green Beret, Commodore of 8 battleships that he commanded in the Pacific, a housewife, a lawyer, a pilot, doctor, a businessman, an employee, everybody. And the key is fighting for it. Where they would fall between the gaps isn't people who had nothing, who were on Medicaid. It was, now that they got to Obamacare, there are problems there. It's all changed. It's the working poor who had insurance but not good insurance. And that's where we'd have problems. And believe me, I would have done it for free, because there's nothing out of this. Almost all the cost is hospital. It's not physician fees. But of course, no hospital is going to let you do it for free. But because at our end, there's no profit. It's not a typical drug company study. So at the end of the day, we don't get a license. We don't get profit from other people doing this. All the drugs we use no longer have patents. They're patent expired. And as a physician, this is what people are missing out there. As a physician, you have the right to treat someone with a medication, provided you're using it at a dose that's available in the literature, that's already been shown in the literature, and that you're not seeking a new indication for it. And people do that all the time. For instance, in autoimmune disease, I see it all the time. When I was doing oncology in a separate life, a separate century ago, literally was the last century, we would use medications all the time that didn't have an FDA approval for that reason. But we would use them. And if you don't, people would be dying all the time. For autoimmune diseases, cyclophosphamide, a very common drug, virtually every autoimmune disease, has no FDA approval for that indication. And it has no patent. It's such an old drug. Steroids. People use steroids all the time for every autoimmune disease, virtually. There's no FDA-approved indication for it, and no drug company will ask for it. And the reason is because they can't patent it. If they can't patent it, all the money they would put in wouldn't work. So we do it to take care of patients all the time. All I did was take these drugs at doses we've used all the time, like in leukemia or autoimmune or aplastic anemia. Actually, transplant for aplastic anemia has been going on since the 60s, and that's an autoimmune disease. In almost all cases. In a few, it's Chernobyl radiation or something, but most people, it's not autoimmune. And transplant worked. So, but the problem is, people in hematology didn't think, well, if it works in this autoimmune disease, let's try MS. And people, neurologists, weren't really aware it's being used in autoimmune disease, so the connection wasn't being made. So it's really making that connection from something and drugs that have been used. The standard drugs for the transplant of aplastic is ATG and cyclophosphamide. And none of those have patents. And those are two of the very common drugs. They're both non-myeloablative that I use in my regimens for autoimmune disease. But unlike a drug company where you have to pay for it to be done, any trial, at the end of the day, you get all this money back when it's shown to work because you have a monopoly. That's what a patent is. It's a monopoly, and you set the price. Whereas we get nothing back in return. We're just doing this to help society. So yes, it is up to the insurance companies to pay, and most of the time if you fight with them, they will, or unfortunately if they don't, it's the family of those patients that come through to have it done. But it's a structure that I live within, but people not understanding the details tweak it to think you're doing something not appropriate and you're charging people money. Yeah. No, in fact, as a physician, my salary is much lower than most because I'm focused on doing this, not generating revenue.
Yeah.
So actually, that's one of the other 4 topics I bring out as what's hindering this field. But what I call it is financial toxicity.
Okay.
And I bring it out in, for instance, MS. So the interferons first became available for MS in the 1990s, 1994. They cost $9,000 a year. As of 2020, they cost $100,000 a year.
No, yep.
What happened? Well, what happened is every new drug came out. Now there's a whole bunch of new drugs. There's like 14 different ones. 2 just came out last year again. The new drugs would go up in price. As they did, the former drugs would match that price.
Yeah.
And so the new drugs are running $100,000 a year, and all the old drugs match it, roughly. They're running $80,000 to $110,000, $120,000 a year. So now, that's what I call financial toxicity.
Sure.
The only drug that's fallen off the scale is Copaxone, because Copaxone lost its patent, and it became generic, and its price dropped 60%. Very rapidly over 2 years. That 60% is probably the true cost today, that 60% fall in price of manufacturing, distributing, and making a profit on the drug.
Right.
But the reason these other drugs are high, you know, I'm not against patents. I'm not against drug companies. They invest a lot of money. If it succeeds, they need that breathing space to make that money back.
Yep.
To do that process, FDA regulations, if you ever read, you know, the Code of Federal Regulations like Title 21, if you ever read the International Code of Harmonization, my goodness, those rules have become so complicated, so strict. It costs so much money. And it's minutia of detail. It's paperwork that has to be done. And that's one of the reasons, although you need oversight, it's one of the reasons why drug costs go up. Drug companies then want more in return when they succeed, because if they don't succeed, they lose a lot of money. But anyway, when the patent goes off, the prices drop markedly. We're using non-patented drugs. So, you know, and we're doing something that at the end of the day, no investor, including me, myself, get anything out of. We're just being good doctors. We're doing what is true academic medicine. So I bring out in here another example, because it's not just in transplant where this happens. Rituximab, a drug against B cells, was found by neurologists to help in MS.
Yep.
Pretty good. And they started using it, and they started writing papers about it. But the FDA never approved it for that. The drug company that made rituximab, which got a patent to use it for ALL and some cancer indications, the patents expired. So they were not interested in looking at a study for MS. Why should they? Someone else will make a generic rituximab, and they're not going to get anything out of it. So long and behold, a guy came along, or a group of people, and they came up with another antibody that targets B cell, the exact same CD antigen on B cells as rituximab, and they call it ocrelizumab. And they did a study, and they found it worked. They got FDA approval. And so that ocrelizumab costs $40,000 an infusion. The way it's given, you give one infusion, 2 weeks later, another $40,000, so that's $80,000, then at 3 months, and then, you know, they can vary. It's usually every 6 months you're giving an infusion, lots of money.
Mm-hmm.
Rituximab was dirt cheap because it's lost the patent. But as soon as Ocrevus came out, every neurologist switched from using rituximab to Ocrevus. Nobody uses it anymore. Mm-hmm. Now, if somebody ever did a study comparing rituximab to Ocrevus, I am my gut instinct, everything tells me the efficacy will be the same. They're targeting the same antigen on the B cell. But the rituximab, because there's no patent on it and it's much cheaper, it's going to be much cheaper. The Ocrevus is going to be much more expensive, but nobody in this current environment will ever do that because no drug company has an interest in that, and nobody out there in taking care of patients is going to do it. They get nothing out of it. And it's not going to be better than Ocrevus. It's not going to be worse. They're just going to show it's much cheaper. So nobody does it. That's financial toxicity.
Right.
So one of the things I bring out is that we need to tweak our system where doctors are taught in their training that not only are they, through their Hippocratic oath and through their education, need to do the best medically for a patient, but also financially.
Right.
Because doctors have no concept of the cost to patients or to the insurance company. So we're trained as professionals, and medicine is a profession, but healthcare is a business. And doctors don't understand that business. And now a lot of doctors are becoming employees of hospitals. They're being pushed, and at the end of the year given a bonus for their RVUs, for the more they bill. So doctors are not understanding it. When big journals, whether it's New England Journal or JAMA or Lancet or whatever, publish clinical data, they never talk about cost effectiveness.
Yep.
And nobody criticizes them for it. And mostly they don't talk about quality of life. That's starting to change. But a lot of these are published without quality of life. All these big drug company trials, they don't publish quality of life in MS. You'll find some later publication like Tysabri, they put all their trials together and they report it because there's a 1-point improvement, but that's of no meaning. So they don't, if you're going to do, when you come to a phase 3 randomized trial, if you could tweak it so you mandate quality of life, you show that all this expense and everything, quality of life gets better as a big outcome, and then cost effective compared to other therapies out there, and reward physicians and patients for being aware and controlling the cost of healthcare. So as I bring out in the last part of the book, medicine and the business of medicine, healthcare is so complex. How do you make tweaks? How do you change it so it's constructive? Well, I think we begin with kind of a general recognition in society that we want healthcare to be advanced, to be affordable, to be accountable, and to be all-inclusive. And I call that the 4 A's. Let's begin there. And then how do you achieve that? Well, those goals contradict each other. Very advanced healthcare requires a lot of money, a lot of expense. It's not affordable. And then it limits its distribution to everybody, so it's not all-inclusive. All-inclusive limits giving the best to everybody. So how do you balance this? One of the ways to do it is set in checks and balances. And if physicians are independent, not employees, so that some institute, or whether it's private or public, is making money off the physician's work and telling them just to go get it, and they don't know what's being charged, what's coming in, but are independent employees. And if we correct this labyrinthine billing system that exists out there, it's like a nightmare of billing, and simplify it, and then give physicians as independent professionals, not employees, but as professionals, the understanding that they're not only there for the medical care of their patients, but the financial. Because if a patient can't afford it, that financial toxicity seriously impacts their medical health and their psychological health. So it's just as important. So that's another one of the key things of the 4 that I bring out in the last chapter. Now, again, it sounds like I'm talking about healthcare policy. I'm really not. What I brought out in the last chapter is to explain why this doesn't take off despite its great success and a great number of misunderstandings that are out there. You're very intelligent. You're saying what everybody says. I've lived it. I know this is being twisted, so it's not being understood correctly. And it's because of the system that we're just accepting and going forward with. That, in other words, no drug company is going to compare their drug to the very best drug out there. You're not going to get approval. They're going to compare it to nothing or to the weakest drug.
Non-inferiority. I've seen too much of that.
So that's what's happened. When you look at these trials in MS, they compared it to nothing, and now they compare it to the weakest, which is interferon Copaxone. They don't compare it to the best out there. Well, that would be crazy. And, I want all drugs have different toxicities. People react differently. So you want physicians to have an array of drugs to be able to use. But the physicians could come in and say, well, we're going to compare Ocrevus to rituximab. No longer has a patent, let's do it. But there's no incentive to do it. There's no reward. And, so it's not done. So what I did is took not one, but a group, 2, 3, 4 non-patent drugs, put them together with a different concept to reset the immune system, not suppress it. And lo and behold, it really works great. And then I bring out cost effectiveness. So now types of transplants vary, whether they're non-myeloablative in cost, whether they're non-myeloablative or myeloablative. With the non-myeloablative way I do it in MS, it's like $100,000. And the hospital still makes money.
Yeah.
But when you look, that's 1 year of drug therapy, even if it's an interferon.
Oh, yeah.
1 year. And yet we're showing that 75% of people remain drug-free for 5 years, and it appears now that I'm just randomly contacting these people, and every one of them still in remission 10 to 20 years out, that this is a tremendous cost savings. And I wrote a paper and I published it. I had a lot of trouble getting that published. Nobody wanted to publish it. I finally got it published, And I did the same. I wrote a paper on CIDP, chronic inflammatory demyelinating polyneuropathy. The standard of care is IVIG. That is so expensive. People pay $12,000 a month for insurance companies. And believe me, insurance companies don't want to pay it. And they stop. The patient has to find the money themselves. Or they crash and they can't move anymore, and the insurance company is forced to pay it again. So transplant, now the way I do CIDP is $125,000 instead of $100,000, a little more expensive, but that's a tremendous cost savings. I mean, in some people I took a patient transplant getting IVIG 5 days a week, the next week 4 days a week, and that continued forever. I mean, he was spending that much money in 6 weeks.
Yep.
So, the transplant was a tremendous savings to health insurance, but physicians aren't thinking that way. It's like, there's so many examples of that. But let's say you take your car to a mechanic and, he has no idea what the cost of anything is. So he just puts in multiple things that are the most expensive and newest. You get this gigantic bill. Well, you're not going to accept that.
No.
But in medicine, that's what's going on. And it's because physicians are totally unaware of the cost or the impact of those charges on that individual patient or on society. And the patients themselves are unaware. And that's an anachronism that needs to change.
Yep.
And if that changed, people would be viewing what I'm doing as really making great sense. And why haven't people been doing this? So it's not that anybody means harm. It's the way our system's gotten structured. And once you get this giant system going that's self-invested, it's really hard to wake people up to change for what our goal is. Our goal and why the system exists, how it started, and it's grown and grown and grown, is for the patient in front of us. And that's what I bring out in this book, that, there's kind of many themes in there that hopefully people will pick up as they read through it. But and hopefully it'll have a bigger impact beyond just these diseases. In fact, on the back cover, we have some endorsements, and one of the people who endorsed it is the former president of Northwestern University. He says, the author's fascinating journey takes us on our own discovery of humanity and medical and healthcare systems and structures for advancing knowledge in healthcare. Dr. Burt has a unique voice and powerful stories to tell. So this could help people beyond converting this chronic disease into a one-time reversible illness into our entire healthcare system and how we approach it. Because I don't think it's sustainable. I don't think this money going in this system is going to be sustainable. And if you don't have top quality healthcare, you're getting stuck with these incredible bills that are shocking. So something has to change here. And this is it's also then what hinders the development of this field.
Yeah, it's and I think, as you say, and if everyone's gonna be reading the book, stories are a way to get that done. And I think, the way you were describing it, and I look forward to get my copy, really seeing the human side of it, as you said, that this is, a lot of this pharma biotech stuff is just over everybody's head. But at the end of the day, as you point, if it can come back, better outcomes, quality of life, and a pharmaco-healthcare economic story as well. I think you're definitely on the right path there.
I'm absolutely not against big farm, not at all.
Me either.
They have their role, they have their purpose. What I'm saying is the system's dropping the ball. There's no counterbalance, there's no checks and balance.
Right.
And I offer some suggestions how to do that. That's why I also want to do these podcasts, is I want this information to get out there. I want people to read this, and I want the lay public to read it, because there's so much confusion, so much misinformation, sometimes even personal. When you do such good things and you get these personal kind of misinformation by bloggers and stuff, you're like, wow, what's going on? But it's because people have limited knowledge. They're not living it. I lived it. And as I lived it, and people would say, why aren't people screaming about this at rooftops to get it? And I started thinking why that is. And so it's not, as in all walks of life, there's politics, there's some people that are vengeful, and there's all these things. But what's holding this back is not a personality. It's a structured system that's meant to do well. But you have to change things as time go on to make sure it does well.
Yep.
That's what this brings out.
Richard, what just while I have you, I mean, how'd you get the Dalai Lama to write what do you call him up out of the blue? Give us a couple minutes on what that story's all about.
Well, thank you for asking, but I'm not qualified. I'm not in the stratosphere where the Dalai Lama is, and so I would have to let him answer that.
Okay.
That's a question you have to ask him. It's just that I hold him in a place of respect, and so I don't have that same qualification.
No problem. I just I wanted to point that out.
His forward is beautiful, and I hope people read it.
Outstanding. Richard, I'm.
And by the way, I end the book. So I start the book with forward by the Dalai Lama. I end it with a quote by the Dalai Lama.
Nice. Well, as I said at the beginning, Richard, I've been following you for a while now. I'm a big fan, and I'll continue to root you on, especially as you spread this message and as you educate and tell these stories about these possibilities. And again, we see so much, but as you said, there are little blips in the press about this drug or that new medical device. But here you have something that works. The impact across literally hundreds of millions of people suffering from these diseases, and really wishing the best with all of it. For everybody, again, that's going to be listening to this particular episode of our podcast across the various podcast networks or watching on the YouTube channel, you've been listening to Dr. Richard Burt, Fulbright Scholar, Professor of Medicine, Scripps Healthcare, retired Professor of Medicine, Northwestern University, CEO of Janani Biotechnology. Pick up the copy of his new book, available tomorrow on all outlets. Everyday Miracles, Curing Multiple Sclerosis, Scleroderma, and Autoimmune Diseases by Hematopoietic Stem Cell Transplants. Richard, again, I want to thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to come talk to us and educate us for a little while. Thanks, obviously, for everything you've been doing throughout your career. And as we like to say on our show here, thanks for helping to create a better tomorrow via everything you're doing. A really great story.
Thank you.